Welcome to tonight's webinar as part of our annual series in August called Back to School Essentials. Tonight, we are excited to be having a conversation with Steve Hoersting, author of Maintaining the Truth, a parent and caregiver's guide to help children and adolescents accept their gifts. For those of you who are new to CMHRC, I'd like to take a moment to introduce myself. My name is Elizabeth Errico, and I am the Executive Director of CMHRC. That's the Children's Mental Health Resource Center. We work with families and providers to shorten the treatment onset delay that too many children and families have to endure, which is 10 years from the time a parent realizes their child needs additional support until the time an accurate diagnosis and effective treatment plan are put in place. All of our programs and services are designed to support children, to support families, and to support the providers who give them the treatment that they need. Tonight, we are going to be meeting with Steve Hoersting. As I said, he is a mental health provider who works in providing educational testing and psychological testing for families. And we are here tonight to discuss how parents can understand these assessment tools, the reports that they come along with, and how they can be of use to families in the planning of their child's IEP and making sure that their children can succeed in school. So, Steve, welcome. We are so excited to have you here with us again. For those of you who have been with us for a long time, you may remember that Steve was with us in February or March, I can't remember actually off the top of my head, of 2023 to talk about his book, Maintaining the Truth. And as you listen to him talk tonight, I want you all to keep in mind that next month in September, on Thursday the 19th, we will be covering his book, Maintaining the Truth, in our book club, and Steve will be joining us to talk with our book club members in an intimate setting about his book and about how parents and caregivers can better understand their neurodivergent children and help them have the tools to support their children effectively. But for tonight, we are going to be talking about educational and psychological testing and how that can be of use to families. So, Steve, welcome.
Glad to be
Why
here.
don't we start with a real general question, which is, can you give us some context about what usually brings parents and kids into your office for testing in the first place?
And normally, there's that word that a lot of the kids use now. Normally,
Right.
but it's I would say for the most part, my referrals come from pediatricians primarily. Parents will come to them, and then they have questions that maybe the school has raised them, or they've just observed themselves or whatever, and so the pediatricians they want to they want to get it right. They don't want to just assume, okay, well, maybe the child has ADHD. I mean, there could be other things. So most of them come from there. I do get referrals quite often also, though, from private schools. They don't have access. Well, they do have access to public school evaluations, but it's extremely difficult in our area to obtain them. And so I work with a lot of them, and at all different levels. It's particularly gratifying for those who have been identified with different things that need the accommodations, and so they'll refer them when they have to take the ACT, so to make sure that they're getting what they need.
Gotcha. So if a parent suspects that there's something going on with their child, where their child needs additional resources, accommodations, or supports, what's the first step for parents in terms of getting answers through this assessment process?
I think, well, I think the first step, kind of going back to the pediatrician, depends on if they've already been there and they've already said, hey, this is what you need, and they've given them some names. if they've gone to the school, the private schools, typically those names. But after that, I encourage, folks to, check their insurance, find out, is it likely to be covered, that kind of thing. And once they if they contact my office, then we set up an initial meeting basically to get a lot of information through filling out things, questionnaires, rating scales, et cetera, so that we can try to cover those areas of potentiality. Is that a word? Anyway, and so we try to cover that, and then we make a plan for the evaluation if it's needed. But let's face it, most of the time, by the time they get here, they've been through a lot, and I can't remember a time where I said, that I don't think they need an evaluation. And sometimes I probably apologize for that. I said, it's like taking your car to a mechanic and say, do I need my oil change? I mean, what, but I would tell them.
Well, I would imagine that parents, by the time they get to you, they have tried a lot of other things. They have tried different pathways, suggestions from friends and family. And by the time they get to your office, they pretty much know that they're not coming in to be told whether or not they need an assessment. They're coming in to be told which assessments are going to be necessary.
Yeah. Yeah. I've had people say, well, if you take them to Steve Hoersting, I mean, he'll diagnose them with X, Y, Z. And I said, well, yeah, I mean, parents are with them every day. I mean, the pediatrician, they've talked just exactly as you said. So what's the likelihood that there's nothing going on that needs to be addressed?
Right. Exactly. So let's dig into these assessments. What are the assessment tools that you typically use in evaluating a kid?
Usually, if it's ADHD, for instance, if that's the main issue, it doesn't mean I won't cover other things, because it may look like a nonverbal learning disorder. But with ADHD, you've got basically I'm gonna use a cognitive test, the Wechsler Intelligence Scale for children, or the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale if they're over 17 or over. So that'll cover working memory, processing speed, et cetera. And then there's tests like the Tower of London, which is executive function test, the Stroop color word test, which the kids tell me, oh yeah, we did that in psychology class in high school. And then the test of variables of attention. So those all kind of dovetail together so that I make sure that we're not just measuring one thing, we're measuring a lot of different things. If it's dyslexia, dyscalculia, I have a hard time saying that one, or dysgraphia, then my go-to generally is the Wechsler Individual Achievement Test. And the reason for that is several things, but one of them is they've incorporated most of the things that I have a sheet that long, and most of the things I don't have to use anymore because they've brought them in together. And they also have an algorithm built in. Now, there's a word that we hear a lot these days, right? And it has an algorithm built in that also takes the information and says, okay, we see a dyslexia condition here, and then, clinical judgment and other factors. Of course, emotional, there's emotional, the tools that we use, depending on the age, sometimes by the parents, sometimes, by the student, child, adolescent. And then then there's, there's a new test that's out that's called the Todd test of dyslexia. So there's a variety of others depending on the age of the child, but that's pretty much the basic thing. Oh, I left out, fine motor. If there's something with regard to that, then I'll use a Bender Gestalt or something that'll look at that area as well.
So and I want to encourage our viewers here to throw questions into the Q&A box. If you have them, we will integrate them into the conversation as we go. Steve, one thing that I'm wondering is, how do you determine ahead of time which tests you're going to use for a particular child?
Okay. Well, again, part of it is age. So that will determine some tests, have a cutoff at 8 years old, some, not. But by and large, it'll be through going through all of the information. For instance, fear of harm. I have, hopefully it's okay, built that into my information gathering tools. And so when we meet together, I'm going to ask the parents, what is your main concern? That the main concern. If they say, well, they just can't pay attention in school. Okay, now let's look at what's going on academically. Is there any concerns there? So if not, then we'll focus on ADHD and maybe nonverbal learning disorder, which could, overlap with things. If it's behavioral, then, fear of harm, the bipolar child bipolar questionnaire comes into play there. So it's really, when meeting with them and what their main concern is, and then from looking at things, just like with the fear of harm, gosh, if you hadn't introduced me to that, not even that long ago, it's amazing how many times now that they come in and they say, well, they're not sleeping well. Oh, really? What's going on? And then I look at back there and they'll have all the symptoms, and it's like, that's not something that they thought of, but we need to look at that.
It sounds like what you're saying is that good assessments are done when you don't make a lot of predetermined decisions about what the child might be presenting with it, and that you're really taking a truly holistic approach to understanding them, not just academically or intellectually, but from a social and emotional standpoint as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think that's the main thing. And I kind of present it to folks this way, that I may only see this child one time in my lifetime. Who knows? And I want to try to get it as right as I can. I'd rather have something that I evaluate that takes 15 minutes and it's like, oh, it's fine, than I would to come back later in my early career and somebody say, oh, well, they needed glasses. Oh,
Right,
okay.
right, right.
Oops.
I've heard folks say that when you're assessing for a learning disability of some kind, like dyslexia, dysgraphia, or dyscalculia, and that one of the metrics that's being looked for is whether there is a gap between the intelligence on the intelligence test and the performance in school. Is that true?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Therein lies some other kind of, I guess, fine tuning of things, that because with the intelligence test, if you have somebody with ADHD, there's a measure, it's called the general ability index. It does not take into account working memory and processing speed. So yeah, it's less, overall comprehensive, but at the same time, I use the example, if I had somebody that had visual deficits and I gave them the intelligence test and they scored it for verbal 130 and they scored a 70 for the nonverbal side, the visual spatial side, would I tell them, oh, their IQ is probably 95? No, no. So the general ability index, especially for those with ADHD, but yeah, there's actually, that's another thing with the Wechsler individual achievement test. There is what we call a yeah, that one, the uh, um, uh, okay, there we go.
That's
Yeah,
okay.
it tells the difference. It's the difference between them and at what percentage. So, for instance, if you have a dyslexia index of 76 and you have an IQ of 130, it'll probably come up and say the base rate for that is 2%. 98% of student would not have a difference that large, and and that's huge.
So that makes me curious. If you have a student who has significant ADHD or dyslexia, Won't that impact their ability to perform on the IQ test?
Not really so much.
Okay.
The IQ test. Well, for instance, it could impact again with that taking into account the general ability index. So, yes, processing speed. If I have somebody that I evaluate that they suspect has ADHD and they do not have slow processing speed, I am really scratching my head and want to make sure we look at other things because I mean 99.9% of the time that's what it is slow processing speed if it's just ADHD. So and I say just, but and if so, you're right. If they, for instance, if they are diagnosed already with ADHD and they're taking medication, I do want to make sure that they take the medication on the day I'm doing the cognitive test because
Mhm.
it will impact that. But as far as the academic, not so much because those are things they do all the time, every day, whereas the cognitive tests are, are new and it's also we're one-on-one and, close proximity.
So we have a question here that came in from the chat, and it says, um, I've seen families where the original testing had an IQ of around 120 or much higher. Then several years later, with a different psychologist, testing had a below average IQ. The psychologist seemed to shrug and say, it is what it is. Parents become alarmed and confused. What could be happening in those circumstances, especially if the kid is living with a mood disorder?
Yeah, well, yeah. First of all, let me say this, that there is a myth that IQ it changes over time. And the fact of the matter is, IQ is pretty stable. So if you do see a difference that large, then it is either that maybe the test that the psychologist used was different, because there are different measures, and some of them, frankly, I think they're more kind of educationally slanted. But also, rapport and mood disorder. If the kid, I had a young person was referred by school because they tried to uh, evaluate his writing for dysgraphia. He wouldn't write for him. He told him, he said, "No, I'll be giving away my secrets." So when he came in to me, I knew that. And I said, going through it, and he was getting reluctant. I said, well, you know what? You can write about anything. I mean, think about it. I'm putting you through this thing. I mean, imagine what you probably think about me putting you through this. So why don't you write a story about what you would do to me if you could? And he wrote a really great graphic novel about how T-Rexes and things would rip me apart and stuff like that. And I got a really good idea of his writing ability. So I don't know if that answered your question.
Yeah, no, it did. I mean, what you're saying is that IQ is pretty stable. And so if there's a discrepancy, likely it has to do with the testing process.
Either the process or the particular test, or like you said, if there's a mood disturbance, but I guess which would be part of the process. Yeah, to just shrug your shoulders and say, it is what it is. I just couldn't imagine that. I mean, that's a time you've got to roll up your sleeves and figure out why that happened, whether it's on the front end or, with the first testing, or or the back end. But it's definitely something that needs to be explored because it really, I mean, would not happen under normal circumstances.
Right. There's another question here saying I had a situation where a 6-year-old was efficiently and appropriately identified as likely living with bipolar through a psychiatrist. How does the psychologist identify this? Maybe this person could add into this something a little bit more specific, because I'm not entirely sure what the question there is. I will wait and bring that back up when we have some more detail. But sort of getting back to this idea that there's an emotional component to the test taking process. How do kids usually manage the test taking experience? I mean, it sounds like you're really working hard to meet them where they are and to make them feel comfortable. But generally speaking, I would imagine this is an intimidating process for a kid.
Well, most of the time, I'd say most of the time, it's pretty smooth. Because I explained to them this is not like school. There's you don't pass, you don't fail. It's an opportunity to try to figure things out, and I try to use those yes questions like, do you really like having to worry about your grades? Do you really like this? And would it be nice to be able to kind of understand why these things happen? And I explained, I'm very self-disclosing, as you know, and I tell them, I said, look, I thought my name was, shut up until I was 10 years old. I mean, I thought I was stupid. I mean, I wasn't a psychologist when I was 10 years old. So, even though I skipped 2 grades at one point, I mean, but you go and you do something, and then what do people say? Oh my gosh, why'd you, do that? So, I self-disclose and explain that to them. And also, make it, hey, do you want some water? Do you want this? I would say one thing. The biggest pushback I get would be, number one, writing. Who likes to really do that with your hand? And so, there sometimes a little bit of that I had actually today, but and then the other thing is the TOVA test for ADHD. It's 21.7 minutes of like really boring stuff, just sitting there clicking a button. And
Right.
but I tell them that. I said, yeah, it's boring. And of course I joke. The woman that explains it when it goes in, I said, look, I'm going to apologize in advance. It's computer talking. I said, she is really kind of, snarky. Okay. I'm just telling you. So I apologize for that. And, it kind of I think breaks the ice a little bit, but they
Um,
handle it pretty well.
I would imagine they do when they have you as the person that they're working with. Um, so when a family goes through this process, when a kid has all these tests and assessments conducted, talk to us a little bit about the report that is generated at the end, because I imagine it's a lot of, and of course I've seen many of them. There's a lot of jargon. There's a lot of throwing around words like processing speed, working memory, those kinds of things, which aren't things that families are really necessarily familiar with going in. So what is in that report that you think is most important for families to be able to understand?
Yeah, it's a good point. I mean, they're probably, in actuality, a lot of things that are in the report that are there to substantiate, as they go to the school or to another provider, so that they know, okay, due diligence was performed, and it was extensive and whatever. But I typically, what I do is when I sit down with them, because I'll send it to them in advance, and then when they come in, they'll have a copy of the report, and we'll go over it. And I go to the cognitive, the IQ, cognitive, but like the IQ test. And again, in my, joking fashion, I usually tell the kids, because, that the majority of kids, they're intelligent, they're, whatever. So I'll say, you're in big trouble now. And I said, I'm going to take you to that page. I'm going to show you I don't know what you're in trouble, because your parents are going to hang this on the refrigerator. And next time you say, I can't do it because I'm stupid. No, you can think it's free country, but no, you're not. And then I go through the subtest. They remember, because I have probably a huge, a large percentage of parents who sit in while I test. And I don't know what other people do. I really haven't checked it out, but I have no problem with that. I absolutely none. As a matter of fact, I think it helps because if the parents do sit in, they know when I would bring up and said, you know how I say, tell me how two words are alike, like, or the two things are alike, three and four, how are they alike? Well, the parent, okay, so when I say that similarities, they know that. When I talk about the academics, so that they have an understanding of it. So what I try to do in that context is just say, okay, look, here's the range of scores, and this is where, it falls. Talk about, the percentage and stuff. And then on the other test, same thing. Uh, if it's a academic test, 85 to 115 scores are in that average range. So, and a lot compare and contrast. If you score 100 for your all your math abilities, and then you score in the 80 standard scores, or percentiles, if you want to say 50th percentile, half above an average, or in reading, you're at the eighth percentile. I mean, pretty easy to understand that there's, hey, guess what, Mom? You're right. Because the parents are they're again a lot more right than they are not.
So we have a question here of asking, why do schools typically not accept a private psychological evaluation, especially when they're so in depth?
Well, I think the probably the largest reason is because of the it's a top down kind of thing. So I know I can only speak for in the area here in Kentucky that I have friends that are teachers and relatives and stuff and they teach even special education, and I taught special education at one point, and it's amazing how many times they get it from the top. Oh, you're qualifying too many kids. You've got too many kids that are getting IEPs and stuff. So of course, I mean, they want to help the kids, but they're, I mean, it's their higher ups that are saying, oh, I had one school that, that they got they got kind of hand whacked for they had too many kids of color identified as having autism. Well, they had two kids in their school that had autism, and one was black and one was white. What are they supposed to do? But they did get it, believe it or not, they got, kind of backhanded. So I think a lot of it comes from that perspective. And so the whole idea is you can have whatever I call it, but if they can't show that it has a substantial impact on their education, then their hands are pretty much tied, and that's where it gets difficult. So you've got parents who are really helping the children, working with them on homework, maybe getting them outside tutoring, whatever, and so they're making C's and B's in school, or even maybe A's because they have 140 IQ, and stuff. And they're saying, well, why would we give them extra help? They're doing fine. But are they really doing fine?
That reminds me of a circumstance that we experienced with a school, not in your state, somewhere else, where the student had bipolar disorder, was stable on medication and doing beautifully, and the school denied the IEP request because the student was stable and able to attend class and able to complete the work. And so the answer was, well, no, you're not demonstrating any difficulty. But the need doesn't go away just because the additional supports are in place. I'm always reminded of the old expression about, if you're standing in the rain with an umbrella and not getting wet, that doesn't mean it's not raining. It means you're
Exactly.
using a tool.
Right.
And it's hard sometimes to acknowledge the reality that schools have in the administrative levels politics that go along with it, and financial concerns and budgetary issues, and it can be hard to say out loud. Sometimes that takes precedence over the child's needs, but I would say it's something that we see over and over and over again.
Yeah.
And so I guess I want to then ask you about, how do parents take these reports, these assessments and their results? How do they use them as a tool to be able to get their child the accommodations that they need? Because it's one thing to get the report and look at it and see your concerns validated, to see that there's objective proof of your child's uh, struggles that aren't their fault. It's because they have ADHD or dyslexia or bipolar or whatever this condition might be. But how do they then use that report and the results to get the supports and the accommodations in the school that their child needs?
Yeah, well, several different ways. I think, again, parents who reach out and go through this process and what, I mean, they're obviously, they're doing everything they can. And it's like you said, they have, probably maxed out on what, they can do, what they know about. So that's one of the things that I really focus on is in the recommendations part. Okay, what could they do at home? And I apologize in advance and say, you're probably doing most of these things, but I want to just make sure that maybe there's something, because even like the way we recommend for homework with a child with ADHD, if you look at it face, it's like, what? I call it the lily pad approach. The frog jumps from one lily pad to the next. So it's math, reading, whatever. They don't get out of the lake. They just jump from one to the other and keep going, not to go outside and get involved in something. And then you have to, go through that push. Then the other thing is the getting back with the primary care physician. So, the pediatrician, and that can generate some support, as well too, because many times they'll collaborate, and with the process. The other thing is, I recommend a lot of times a website called rightslaw.com, WRIGHTS, law, because you can ask them questions. They have sample letters, because, if you know the law, at least you have the ability to say, write a letter and say, I've had my child privately evaluated and they have a disability, identified, or disorder, whatever, in this area. And I would like to have a meeting to discuss this and the development of, plan. And they help in a way that it's pretty much, I mean, then it fits the process. They have, once they get that letter, for instance, I think, they have 2 weeks to respond, set up a meeting. They have 60 days to, test, which then become, or if there's additional testing needed, usually with my reports, what they have to do if they're going to kind of tidy it up, so to speak, is behavior observations, because I haven't been in the classroom to do that.
Right. So something that I've heard before more than once is the school does their own testing. The public school does their own testing, and they'll say, well, your child's IQ and their performance are aligned. And so that means they don't need accommodations. They are performing at the level that we would expect them to based on their IQ scores. I'm curious what your thoughts are on that.
Well, I actually, there was one special education director that I've worked with over the years, and I really valued her approach. And that was, if you had a child with ADHD, for instance, it makes it a little bit easier. Number one, she really wanted an algorithm to be developed, and we tried, but we got a lot of pushback from mostly school psychologists who didn't like it being taken out of their hands, and stuff. So, but she used, for instance, a Vanderbilt. So the kid could be making, good grades, they could be all those things. But if the teacher said that they meet the criteria in the classroom, according to like Vanderbilt, they were entitled to either a 504 plan, which is carried out by the classroom teacher, or an individual education plan, which then, is carried out by people who are paid under Title B or Part B funds or whatever. So, but with the educational part, it is very difficult. But it's very uncommon, in my experience at least, if for kids to have IQ scores, if they have other disorder, have IQ scores and educational scores that are academic achievement scores that are similar. It's typically fairly obvious about that. Now, one exception to that can be, I think, and this is, I go to great pains to try to point this out in the reports and things, is for those who have really high IQs, because you've got somebody with 140 IQ and they have an average reading score. Well, average could be anywhere from 85 to 115. So they say, well, hey, they're reading at an average rate, but it's 85 and their IQ's 140. I mean, really? Don't you think? So that becomes kind of an issue. And it's really hard. I mean, it's hard to battle it. It really is. And we used to have here an organization. I mean, they're still here, but it's really hard to access them. And I think in part because of what we're talking about here, but it was Children's Law Center. They would go with the parents to the meeting and represent them. And again, this special educator that I knew, she welcomed them to come because it helped her to justify to her higher ups, look, what was I supposed to do? I mean, right. Yeah. Do you want to get sued or not?
So it sounds as though those two tests, the IQ test and the general performance indicator test, are really extremely important for accessing accommodations or justifying that accommodations are required. There's other testing, though, that you do that must indicate what types of accommodations then are necessary. And I'm assuming you're including that in your recommendation sections as well. But can you talk us through what that's like? How do you determine what the child needs?
Well, like, again, if you've got academic, if it's dyslexia, that kind of thing, you're talking about, that they need to have that specific, specific to dyslexia type of approach. Like Orton Gillingham is one of the names that, gets thrown around. You can't tell a school how to remediate, unfortunately. I mean, you can tell them, but you can't demand it. So that really becomes a little bit of a tougher issue. But there are other things like within the testing, and if there are fluency items. Fluency items are, what you can do with certain speed. So even though if a person is functioning in an average level reading, but when you put them under time constraints and it goes way down, well, that I mean, to me, that's a big, indicator of, hey, they need more time, for tests. So so the academic achievement tests have some of those, but I also use tests like the Stroop color word test, which measures speed of word reading, speed of being able, that what we call neurological interference, is can you push back previous information to access new information? I use the Tower of London. So the TOVA test showing that, there is this, even if they're on medication, the TOVA test, if it shows they're still below that level, the parents may not want to have them on more medication. So what do they need? They need a separate place and extra time. And Russell Barkley, one of the big guys in in the field, has said that the biggest thing is the separate environment rather than even the extended time. So, and it's amazing with the private schools. Like I said, the one high school, the person that worked with them, the kids there, she was, I mean, unbelievable. She would send kids, to me, would evaluate them, and she would end up on the ACT being able to get them, accommodations, double time over multiple days. Because, that's another thing, that stress, that mental, anguish that they go through. So she was able, to do that because they're not hamstrung.
Right. And what you're describing is reminding me of something that circles back to something that is being asked in the chat, in the Q&A, which is that everything that you're describing in terms of needs or contributing factors related to ADHD or dyslexia absolutely applies to kids who have mood disorders, right? The anxiety and the stress that goes along with the assignments, with the tasks, the need for extra time, and that those things can't always be identified based on IQ or general performance. And so one of the questions that we're seeing here is that, trauma and mood disorders and other mental health disorders, those symptoms can sometimes mimic ADHD, or perhaps those symptoms, we should say, overlap with ADHD. And can you use these assessments to sift through the differences if a kid comes in because the parent suspects dyslexia, but by the time that you're finished, you're seeing that maybe it's a mood disorder? Like, how are you using these assessments in order to make the determination of why the brain is reacting the way it does, not just that it's reacting the way it is?
Right. Well, it's a good point. That's why, again, that overlapping of assessment tools is really important. Also, the observations, when you're doing the testing, because, like, let's say autism and nonverbal learning disorder, I mean, they can look very similar. You've got a person with 140 left brain IQ and 100 right brain. Well, it's difficult for them to pick up on social cues. They can have difficulty with writing, balance, a lot of different things. And it can look like what we used to call Asperger's or autism. So I rely, of course, on gathering as much information as I can from multiple sources, in that way. The other thing is from the kiddos themselves, having them complete, rating scales or really personality inventories, but for them. And and then again, looking at the scores. If you have I mentioned before about processing speed. Let's say I have a young person come in and I give them an IQ test, and everybody's rating them as having the ADHD symptoms. I give them the IQ test, and their processing speed is average. I mean, it fits with everything else. And I do the Tower of London, where it's measuring processing speed, executive function, it's planning skills, and it's fine. Then Stroop test, fine. Well, guess what? Okay. And on their personality assessment and stuff, they're saying, I hate school. I don't want to be there. I don't have friends, stuff. Well, then to me that, that's where I'm going to go with that evaluation. Somebody may disagree, with it, but the fact is, I mean, if I've got all these other 4 things and they're not validating this ADHD thing, but they're showing those emotional sides, then that's where I'm going.
So we have a follow-up question here on that, on the impacts of testing participation. What do you do with a child who is demonstrating a freeze response, perhaps curling up and sleeping perhaps from exhaustion from testing, refusals to come back after breaks, or when a kid is really slow to warm up to the testing process or communication. How do you get accurate results when you have a child who's, I mean, really what they're asking here is, how do you get accurate results when the child is not a willing participant in the testing process?
Yeah, good question. And fortunately for me, I, I don't have that happen very often. I really don't. I think one reason is because I break it up. So the longest period of time that I typically will have, I mean, unless there's some rare circumstance, is 2 hours. And that 2 hours, is that, they go to the bathroom or, whatever, that kind of thing. And it again, and it's different things, and I use technology, so they do a lot of things on iPads, and that kind of they see that, and I think that kind of gets them going a little bit. Um, I have things available, like if they're starting to struggle, I've right where they're taking the testing. I had a teenager tell me about this. He said, "Hey, you've got glass on the top of your desk. Why don't you put white paper under there?" I thought, oh, okay, I guess it's make you see the test stuff better or something. Then he came back in. He said, "Where's the markers?" I said, what do you mean markers? Oh, oh, yeah. So now kids, draw on it. I don't know if it, probably shouldn't. Yeah. Anyway, just, but we had a little guy having trouble going to school, and yeah, so yeah. I mean, they come up with all kinds of stuff, that about those things. And so that I think that helps a little bit, the time. But in the event that they, are, really resistant and stuff, my thought would be is let's try to work on it, work through it, talk about it, and use it, and then do something different, have them come back in a different way.
I, I mean, it sounds so compassionate. What you're describing is that if you have a child who's not a willing participant in the testing, you meet them where they are and you make them comfortable so that they're able to engage the process. But I suppose not everyone thinks that way, and not everyone conducts the assessments that way, which may make it harder for the kids who are. Would you go so far as to say that if the child doesn't want to participate in the testing, that it's really just time to find a new testing psychologist?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's the same thing, therapy, same way. The research has proven time and time again that the techniques that you use are far less important than the
Relationship.
yeah, thank you. Yeah. They call it, I think I forget what anyway, but it's how you look or something. I don't know. It's what they call
Right.
it. But yeah, so absolutely, if it's not working, and also because it may not be the person, but let's think about, everybody being different. And Children's Hospital, for instance, in Cincinnati, we have, I mean, awesome, a wonderful place. But I'm pretty sure that if I was a little guy, I mean, just me, I'm not saying all of them, but me, if because the hospital, I remember, going to the hospital for things, and and I think it would, for a lot of kids, that could be really, really difficult for them. Um,
Yeah.
Even at school, I think a lot of times you may get less of, say, IQ test, things like that, and more resistance, because I mean they're coming into an office and their buddies are out there in the hallway and stuff like that, where here, I mean, we talk about it the first meeting, how it's confidential and stuff. And of course, I don't know that, I mean, I've got the kids love squishmallows and whatever they're called, and I've got them all over the place. So, they all have names, and I introduce them all and stuff like that. So, now that with a teenager, it's not that important.
So we have a question here about a technical question. What is the standard deviation or range of working memory, processing speed, or IQ that would qualify a child for an IEP?
Wow, that's a good question. I don't, well, the answer, I guess, should be, I don't know that it is, but it should be in that range of standard deviation and a half. So you're talking about roughly 22 points if you want to, kind of look at it as there. If you have that range of a difference, that's significant. And so that's where, well, I guess it wouldn't be just the IQ, but when you're talking about the academics, that ability achievement discrepancy analysis that I couldn't think of before, that is really important, because again, you're talking about 98% would not have a difference at large. So I think in the old days, and I'm old, so I remember those days. In the old days, it actually, that's how kids qualified. 21-point difference was like the magic number, which was sad, because if they had a 20-point difference, guess what?
Yeah.
Yeah, didn't happen. Except they did have in Kentucky this thing called the yeah. Why can't I think of all these names? But it basically, I could write a dissertation using information from everybody. Override, the override. I was known as the king of the override. I would write up this thing and basically saying, look, everybody agrees at this table that this kiddo, in spite of that 1-point difference, needs it. And so the dissertation allows them to get the help that they need. Well, they did away with that, of course. They don't want us to, they don't want people thinking. Just do.
So there's another question here in the chat. What accountability should schools have for students that have an IEP but are not passing their classes, not just in one school year, but over the course of multiple years?
Well, and I think that's one of those things where contacting advocacy like you have, or if there, other advocates in the area, to be involved in that process. So the accountability, well, I mean, there is a thing that sometimes happens with, in school districts where they don't meet the child's obligations. And at some point, if it goes to legality, they will, have to, I'm not going to remember the name again of it, but they have this compensation for those years missed. There have been children that I know around here, it's been a long time, but who have gotten 2 years of college paid for by the school district because the parents were able to prove that it was brought up that they had a learning disorder, and everybody just kind of said, well, I mean, whatever, and ignored it. Because it's really no different if a parent says, I think my child has a disability, that the reaction should be no different than if the child comes to school and they have a black eye, and you say, oh, what happened? And my mom hit me. Well, they know exactly what they have to do legally. Well, same thing with this. They have to take some kind of action. And if they're not making progress and nothing has changed, they're doing the same thing over and over again without making, the revisions and stuff. I think, it makes a pretty strong case for, having something done, whether it's the school district paying for some outside interventions or, that kind of thing.
So Steve, I'm curious what you think about my take on this, which is that, after years and years of going through this with lots of families, that, there's sort of different levels of holding the school's feet to the fire. And the first is, the parents, and I love that you shared the resource of Wright's Law, because that's a wonderful tool for parents to be able to read about what the laws are. But it sort of starts out with this conversation, between the school and the parents. And this is really where I always say to parents, having somebody else at that table with you who's impartial is only going to be an advantage to you, because you go in there as the parent and you don't have to go in there as the person who's trying to educate the school on what your child needs. And that's what we do, as you mentioned, as part of our school mental health advocacy program. We go into those meetings, we sit there, we share the mental health context and information on mental illness and how the child can receive accommodations, which allows the parents to maintain their relationship with the school, with the teachers, where they're not the ones making unreasonable demands.
Yeah, right.
We're the ones who are going in and saying, no, the child needs this, that, or the other thing. But sometimes that doesn't work. And then, you really have to say, well, the school's not meeting their needs for the child. So we need to bring this up a level. And that's where, you're getting those lawyers involved. You're having a
Yeah.
lawyer sit at the table so that hopefully there is not necessarily litigation, but you have someone there who's going to be able to talk you through what the legal obligations are that the school has. And then when that, if that doesn't work, then there are higher levels of litigation, and there's getting the Office of Civil Rights and the Federal Department of Education involved to really hold the school's feet to the fire. But all of that starts with having good, solid, documented assessments that demonstrate the need that the child has. You can't hold the school's feet to the fire unless you have the information that comes from the assessments that you do saying that the child needs them and why. Would you agree with that?
Oh yeah, yeah. Both on both counts. I think that's a great point. If you can have somebody with you, it's one thing that I've wanted, I guess, and I'm not going to say wish, because I know we're not supposed to say that unless we have a plan, for it. But for somebody that I would have in my stable, so to speak, that when I did the evaluation, that they could go with the parent. I mean, I've always thought, gosh, because there's no way I have the ability, time to do that. So that is certainly important. And then and like you said about the having that conflict, I can't tell you how many times parents will tell me, if I bring this up about, getting, legal advice and things like that, well, but they'll take it out on my child. I don't want them to take it out on my child. Whether they will or they won't, I mean, it's a fear, and it's a legitimate fear. I mean, and so that's one part of the process. And then the other piece is, again, being able to, take it, further if you need to, and have those resources. One thing that oftentimes it's kind of interesting, you have like Kentucky Department of Education. Well, I had a parent come in, and after I did the evaluation, and child had dyslexia, and the principal had told the parent that Kentucky doesn't recognize dyslexia. I said, oh, that's really interesting. How about if you go to the KDE website, and, oh, by the way, here's a copy of it. And it says, important to identify it before the third grade. And, and how many states recognize it? Oh, Kentucky's one of the 13 states. And, oh, there's 10 things that you're supposed to do. And Kentucky's one of them that recommends all 10 things or something. And so, I mean, the things that will come out of people. But anyway, calling KDE, I know a lot of times I hear from, people that work in the schools that say, oh, geez, the parents called Kentucky Department of Education, and they said, oh yeah, he should have an IEP, and tell them all that stuff. And then it's like the school's like, what? They're the ones that are getting on our back about this. So I guess the sad thing is, I wish I had the answer, except that the answer I have is that it is complicated. And so it goes back to what you said before, that, if your child had a heart condition and you'd been to, two cardiologists, and you've been to wherever, and, and you live in Lexington, Kentucky, for instance, gosh, go to Children's Hospital, go to wherever, and I mean that they would do that. Well,
Hmm.
I think it's the same thing. And I'm frankly, I'm a little so there are times when I, it's lately a lot of the people have retired that I worked with. Um, but it was really nice to have people like you and some of the docs over at Children's Hospital who could put their stamp on it. And then all of a sudden, it's not just Steve Hoersting, saying it, it's Dr., so and so.
Right, right. Um, so there's a question here that I think is really great that I want to make sure we get to, and we're officially out of time, but we're going to stick around and answer a few more.
Sure.
Which is I heard testing should be updated about every 3 years. How often should a student be evaluated again? Schools in my state say that 1 year before they start college, so the colleges have the most recent evaluation. So there's actually a couple different questions here, so I'm going to break this up. The first question really is how frequently should these tests be administered? We do hear 3 years. Is that they should not be administered more frequently? What is that 3 year benchmark about?
I think largely it's kind of tied into the different stages of school. For instance, if you're in the third grade and you get evaluated, well, now okay, in a typical setting, okay, middle school starts. So wouldn't it be it'd be a good idea to have a reevaluation prior to entering middle school,
Mhm.
which then is usually 3 years, and then you've got high school, and then you've got the ACT. So I think that's where most of that, comes from. So the 3 year cycle. Now, should that be, etched in stone? No. I mean, if the child's not making progress, then absolutely. I mean, people should be, they should be looking at it. And if further evaluation is needed, that wherever and whoever. And I have to say, I mean, again, a lot of the schools here will, they'll do that. They'll recommend. And they'll start with the pediatrician because one of the fears, and I'm sure you've heard this many times, is the fear is, well, if I say to the parent, you should have further testing done on, for your child, that, oh gosh, the school's going to have to pay for it.
Mm.
Well, I've been doing this probably 40 years, maybe something like that. And the only time I've ever had a school that had to pay for it because of that, it was the opposite, that the school didn't say something and they kind of bluffed it, shrugged it off, whatever. And they came in and they did have a major disability in an area. And so, yeah, again, the legal part, so school paid for the evaluation. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So the next question is, which is related to it really, is that, can schools rebuff the request for these evaluations and say, well, no, you're going to wait. We're going to wait and do those before they go. Let's say they're in first grade. Can you say, well, no, we're going to wait and do those before they go to middle school? Or let's say they're freshmen in high school and the school says, no, we're going to wait until they're seniors so that it's applicable to college. Can they put it off for those reasons?
Well, they can try. I mean, that I mean, that happens for sure, but it's not. I mean, again, that's where that knowing the law or having somebody represent. Because if you write the letter in such a way that I suspect my child has a disability, or they're not, goals aren't being met, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, yeah, they can say that, but then if they go and have an outside evaluation and it shows that the parent's correct, which they usually are, they're with them all the time, then it's a big problem. Um, and it's kind of interesting because there are some school districts that over the years that have taken a position of we'd rather be sued than give in.
Mm.
And that's interesting. But yeah.
And I've heard you say something a couple of times now that I want to sort of draw a line under is you keep talking about parents as sort of the experts in their children, which is something that we talk about all the time, and the fact that parents are really in these circumstances being asked to be professional parents, so to speak, and coming in as that parent professional and saying, I've done my homework on what my child's rights are. I've done my homework on what my rights are. I've done my homework on what these tests mean and what the results mean and what the school is obligated to do. And that's really a necessary component of the process.
Yeah. Yeah, it is. And unfortunately, I mean, it's difficult, again, to come by. And when you say that, I know you have the parenting groups, and I've been there, so I'm assuming maybe some of this comes up, but it would be nice if there were more outreach, programs for parents to be able to, I guess, kind of go through that, that process and know what it is that they can do. And because I wanted to mention one thing you brought up about before they go to college. There was they were trying to pass the legislature, the United States legislature was trying to pass a bill that would require colleges to automatically accept, basically roll over what the student had in high school without, giving them a hard time. Basically, if you're having these accommodations, you get them in college. Now, it didn't pass, but the good news is that most colleges that, I have had, most colleges are, it's not a big deal. I mean, it's actually easier than it is to get, help other ways. Now, having said that, one of the things that I get pushed back a lot on, and I have to, defend myself. I'm probably sure I sound defensive when I do it, but is this idea that, okay, if they're 16 years old going on 17, and they're going to be going to college, I had one university really, really pull my chain on the fact that I gave the kids' version of the test. Well, I did explain to them that that is not an automatic. The research says that at least maybe the WAIS 5 that's coming out will be better. That's the adult version. But that if you suspect a low intellectual level and they're in that 16, 17 where you can use either one, you're better off to use the adult version. I can't explain all the statistic properties of it, but that's what the research says. And if you suspect otherwise, you're better off to give, the children. And I think part of that, at least for the children's one, is if you have 20 items and you miss one, it's not going to impact your score as much as if you're starting, and you only climb the ladder, at
Right.
5 items. So they really busted my chops, but it was good because I did learn what the word copious meant, because I didn't know that. And when they said they were going to turn it over to their psychologist who has copious abilities in this matter, then I had to look it up and find out what it meant. So.
Well, you bring up an excellent point that we talk about actually quite a bit, which is that when we're working with families on our school mental health advocacy program, schools very often use as a justification for not giving the child accommodations, high schools in particular, that when they get to college, they have to be able to do these things and they're not going to have accommodations, and that giving them the accommodations in high school isn't setting them up for the real world. And all of our experience shows that that's absolutely not true, that oftentimes the colleges have better programs for implementing accommodations. And, I myself taught undergraduate psychology for a decade, and I could tell you that that I did not have, not that I would have wanted it, but I had no leeway in whether or not I was willing to grant the accommodations to the students in my classroom. They had accommodations. They were granted those by the Department of Students with Disabilities. And I was required by the university to make sure that my students who had accommodations got every single one of them in my class with no exceptions. And I
Yeah.
think that people often don't realize that they were going to be asked to do this in the real world argument. It doesn't really hold a lot of water.
No.
And that the quote real world college is oftentimes much more accommodating than the high schools or middle schools are willing to be.
Well, yeah, it's like I had a person come to me that they had dyslexia, and they had gotten accommodations and things over the years. So they had a job, and they really liked the person, and they wanted to keep the person stuff, but the typos and things were bothersome. Well, the reason why it continued was because I guess the company, the whatever, they wouldn't authorize the Grammarly to be allowed to be placed on the person's computer. So after, proving the disability still exists, I mean, it doesn't go away,
Right.
then the person who wanted to keep the person was able to make the case, and voila, so yeah, that argument, I mean, it, the ADA, and, it goes, along through the rest of your life. And I'm I think a prime example of, if anybody that's listening tonight knows, I'm 71 years old, and I think my ADHD still exists for sure.
So So we are gonna wrap up here,
Oh,
and
darn.
I just want to say, so a couple of folks are asking for referrals to specific providers. If you have questions about that, you can email us at info@cmhrc.org, and we will be able to get some information to you. Although as a national organization, we do not have referrals to make in every location, or in every state. If you happen to live in Kentucky, you would be lucky enough to be able to see Steve. But yeah, go ahead and send us an email about that. So my last question for you tonight is, what advice would you give to families who are just starting out on this testing journey? What do you think that families need to know before they start about what to expect and how to handle it?
Well, I think again, one of the things is, and I know I've referenced the pediatricians. They'll probably, if any of them would be listening, but stop it. But anyway, I mean, most of them have a list, of people that they've, worked with, and they feel comfortable with, and that kind of thing. And they also know about insurance. So, I mean, they're really good about that, with medication. A lot of times they would like to prescribe this one, but they know it's not going to it'll be expensive. So, they think about that stuff. I mean, they're like surrogate parents to us almost, So, that's one thing. The other thing is, if they're starting out, I think making sure, unless money's no object, making sure that, as best the insurance, covers it. Now, I would not call the insurance company directly, because if you do, if you say something like, well, why are you having him tested? And you say, well, because his education is suffering, click. Yeah, not happening. The state of New York just passed a law, that the only state in the union that passed a law that insurance companies have to pay for testing for dyslexia and those other things. But, it used to be they didn't cover autism. Well, that got, they didn't cover ADHD. That got, but there's still the educational part. You'll get a click. So knowing the right words, to say, it is really important. And, and so I mean, if they reach out to you, I mean, if it is somebody in this area and they, have a question about that, I mean, I really don't have a problem. They email me, just, I can, tell them the words to use or whatever. But, also universities can be helpful. Especially the ones that offer, like there's in the local area, College of Mount St. or Mount St. Joseph University now. They have a wonderful program. I forget the name of it, but for their students, a wonderful program. So that is, a university that you could call and probably, get some good information, from, that could be, helpful to you. So, the local, universities as well. So, where to start. And then, you make your phone calls and you find out, okay, is it going to take, this long? Because remember with educational things, again, I think this is universal, but anyway, they have 60 days. If they have a meeting and decide that they're going to do an evaluation, they have 60 school days to complete it. So if this is in May, guess what? It's not going to be fulfilled until October.
Right.
So if you call a place and, and they say, well, it's going to take 2 months to get in, that's probably still a lot faster. And especially if insurance is going to, cover it, it's going to be a
Right.
lot.
Excellent point.
Yeah. So.
It does. So now I want to remind everybody that on September 19th, Steve is going to be joining us for our book club, where we're going to be talking about his book, Maintaining the Truth. And you can sign up for that book club session on our website. You can also buy the book through us so that you can have it in advance of the book club session. So I encourage folks to go and to sign up for that so you can be in this small setting with Steve to talk about the book. And Steve, now I want to give you a moment to sort of explain what your book is about, pique people's interest, because it really is wonderful.
Well, the main point of the book, and actually, I'm glad you asked, because a couple times I've had to explain. Well, I didn't have to, but I did explain to people that when I say maintaining the truth, parent caregiver's guide to helping children, adolescents, accept their gifts. That when one parent said, "You mean to tell me that you think it's a gift that my autistic child is?" Child with autism, whatever, is in the background screaming, and stuff. No, that's not what I'm talking about. No, that's not a gift. And if somebody comes up to me and says, well, you're so lucky to have ADHD, I might go to jail. But the point is that, there are these other gifts that can get so easily lost. I mean, this one girl, I guess I should say person, so I don't want to identify them, but oh my gosh, the athletics. I mean, didn't even know it. She didn't even know it, and it's like she got her, her wheels back, finding out about dyslexia and things like that, and so then the confidence and then she saw this particular sport and it's like, then they got a really great coach. And the next thing you know, I mean, I'm seeing her all over the internet. I mean, but those gifts, and it's really easy it's just really very easy. So whether it's, autism, actually, there's a really interesting book for ADHD. And it's called Thriving with ADHD. And it's just really cool because it's kind of sounds like, oh, that's great. No, it's really getting them to think about, like, there's one example just quickly where they take their name. And so, take Steve and Steve. So of course with me, I have a hard time coming up with, so I get, C, super, T, terrific, E, evil. Oh no, I guess that doesn't work. So anyway, but it gets them, that forces them to at least think about that there's more to them than just a label.
And I love that. And one of the reasons that we love you and love this book is that we really firmly agree with you. Kids are more than just their diagnoses. It is absolutely imperative that their diagnoses be taken seriously, that they receive the support and help that they deserve in order to be able to thrive and have opportunities. But that is not the sum total of who they are. And we always want to help parents and support them to be able to find all those wonderful things about their children that make them unique and make them precious. And
Yeah.
so please join us next month, September 19th, for our book club with Steve. You can also join us next week. We are doing a clinical seminar for professionals, although it is open to others as well, on differentiating bipolar disorder from borderline personality disorder in teens. Next month, we have new webinars and clinical seminars, as we always do each month. And you can check out our website under the free resources menu tab to get a list and sign up opportunities for all of our upcoming free webinars and clinical seminars. Steve, thank you so much for being with us tonight. It was a delight, and I know that I learned a lot, and I'm sure the rest of our audience did as well. So thank you, and we look forward to seeing you next month at Book Club. Thank you, everyone, for being here, and we look forward to seeing you again soon.
And
Good
thank you
night.
for everything you do.
Thank you. Bye now.
Bye.